Okay, so testing React components, tips and tricks. So my name is Stephanie. I'm a full stack web developer and I work at ThoughtWorks, but I started off in JavaScript and it's my first love. So what are we going to cover today? So I'm going to start off with a quick introduction on why testing in general, why should you test, what should you test, and how do you test React components. And I'll start off with just a sense of what your experience is with testing. And then we'll move on to an example. So in the spirit of Christmas, the example is a Christmas advent calendar. And hopefully we'll start off with some basic testing examples, and then hopefully we'll have time to get to the bonus examples, which will be a few concepts more in depth. So why test? So how many people like testing? Hands. Okay, cool. And how many people have already written tests for React? Okay. All right, that's a fair number of you guys. So I feel like I'm kind of probably preaching to the choir a little bit here. I think one of the aims of this talk is, because you know testing is so important, I would also like to kind of teach you some tips, hopefully ones that you didn't know, or some tricks to make it a little bit easier, because the easier it is, the more you'll do it. And yeah, I mean, I guess we don't really have to talk about this, but this slide was basically the first 2 years I was a developer. I actually didn't, the places that I was employed at, like, we didn't write any tests, and it made me really nervous, so I kind of felt like this guy when I didn't have any tests. And for me, the biggest reasons why I write tests is two things, really. Like, one thing is that you kind of know that everything works as expected. And the second reason is when you change things, you know that you haven't broken anything that you've written before. There's tons of other good reasons why you test, and I'm sure you guys already know some of them, including like self-documenting, how they save time, and you write better code. So I'll show you an example. The first example we'll do is an example of doing TDD, which you guys may or may not follow strictly. And I'll just show you how you can kind of use that to control flow. So first, what should you test? So if you're already familiar with testing, I'm sure you might have seen this testing pyramid before. But this is stolen from Martin Fowler, who's also a thought worker. And it basically shows the kind of 3 big levels of testing that you should do. And with the idea being that you should have kind of the most number of unit tests, because they're the easiest to write. Unit tests kind of test a particular method in the code. They're kind of testing the smallest unit of code that you write. And the service layer would be testing any API calls that you're making. So if you have an API layer, maybe you write it in Node, you would test the service layer. And the UI tests would be for the end-to-end tests. So this is actually testing what a user would be clicking around on the browser. And the UI tests kind of take the longest time to write. So if you guys have written UI end-to-end tests before, maybe using Selenium, they take a really long time to run. They're kind of time-consuming to maintain. And so really, you should be focusing the most on this unit layer. And if you've already written tests for React, you kind of know about writing unit tests, because you would have used some of these test runners. And the idea is with the unit tests that, like, how should you test in React? So it's the same idea that you would want to test anything with logic. So this is kind of the concept for the unit tests, and you can kind of extend it to the service layer as well. The UI tests are more for the user's flow, but anything with logic, and I put this in quotation marks because you can really take this as far as you want. The highest value would be things that have quite complicated logic, or things that maybe are really important that if it wasn't there, the app would kind of not really function without it. So how do you test React components? So there are a few things that you will probably need. And some of these you might be using already. So one is a test runner, and the test runner is the thing that actually runs the unit test code and compiles it. So it executes them and it writes them to the console or log files. You will need an assertion library, So this verifies the results of the test. So when you have like the expects, you would need some mocks and stubs, so things that create fake objects to simulate the behavior of real objects, and you would need some React testing utilities. So you might have used things like Enzyme before. So Enzyme is a library that's created by Airbnb, and it wraps a few of the other standard React testing utilities, and it helps you traverse and manipulate the DOM. So this is what I mostly end up using. I don't know, maybe hands up if you guys have a similar kind of stack. Cool? Okay, cool. The reason that I end up using these particular libraries is that in the latest, so in Create React App, it comes bundled with Jest, and Jest has gotten really, really good the last couple years. So previously to this, I might have used something like Mocha or Jasmine, but now Jest has gotten really, really good, and they have this additional thing, which we'll cover in the bonus examples, called snapshot testing, and it kind of helps you do some of the more basic traversing through the DOM. So that's like a nice added benefit, and it comes bundled in Create React App already. Enzyme is a really nice, it's much better than the React testing utilities in terms of like the functions that they give you. So that's one reason to use Enzyme. And Jest actually comes with mocking support, but Sign-On is another library that you might use. It's a little bit nicer for mocks. Okay, cool. So we're going to move on to the examples. And for this, I'm going to show a quick. So this is my example. It is a different kind of advent calendar. Hopefully, we don't have any vegetarians in the crowd that are deeply offended by this. But I created this a few years ago, and I don't like chocolate, so that's why it's meat. And I'm just going to show you kind of how it works, because we're going to be actually building the React components for it and testing them. So here is the calendar, and basically, you can click on, some days are already open, and today's the 12th of December, so you can click on this one and it will display this fun, Cool, so that's the app, and we're just gonna start testing it. So I'm gonna go back to the presentation. Sorry. Thanks. So the first example is a JavaScript unit test. So this is probably maybe the type of test that you could write for any JavaScript framework, so not just React. And we're just gonna start with this one as the simplest example. So in this case, we're actually just building a helper to check whether or not the box should be open. And this is our first, so I'm going to do this in a TDD way, and then I'm just going to talk about some gotchas in using the Enzyme library here. So if we're doing TDD, first we would actually write the test first. So in this case, the describe block would indicate what you're testing, so it's the box open helper, and it should return true if today's date in December is after the box's number. The second test we'll write is it should return false if today's date in December is the same as the box number. Can anyone guess what the next test we'd write would be for this? So should return false if today's date in December is before the box's number. So these are kind of like the three possible outcomes for this helper that we're going to write. And one nice thing about TDD is it kind of maybe allows you to plan your plan of action. Like you can kind of think about it the way that a user would expect the box to behave and then actually implement it. So in this case, we are using the assertions library provided by Jest. And so this is, if you look at the Jest documentation, it will give you all the possible expectations that you can do on this. And I have 3 examples here. I just want to highlight the difference between these expectations. So in this case, in the first case, if the current day in December is after the box number, then the box should be open, right? So if you saw in that previous website, all the ones previously to today, all of those boxes were open. So Jest provides this thing called to be truthy. And so one gotcha about to be truthy is that it doesn't only check if the result is true. There are tons of things that could be truthy, right? So it just checks that it exists. So equally so, to be falsy means, if it's null, if it's nil, if it's an empty string, possibly the empty string, iffy about the empty string, it will also be falsy. So the other one you could use is to equal false. So the gotcha about the difference between equal and to be is that equal actually just checks the value, and be checks the value and the type of the object. So in this case, if it's a value, this is my preferred method, to be, so you just explicitly check what is the value and the type, and is it what you're expecting. Yeah. So here you actually write the helper itself, and as long as all the tests pass, you know you've written this correctly. So one thing that you might notice is, which might seem a little bit silly, is that there's actually a lot more test code here than there is implementation code. And for some reason, for some people that might be like a deterrent to writing tests. It's really up to your discretion how much you want to do. My second client project at ThoughtWorks, I was working on a trading app for a bank with a backend in Java, and I actually had never worked in Java before. And the tests for me, like I had to follow TDD super strictly because I was really terrified of making a mistake. And yeah, so I mean, I think that that's another added benefit of doing things the TDD way, is it helps you plan your approach, and you know that the stuff that you're making is going to work as expected. Okay, so the second example is a basic shallow render. So if you've used Enzyme before, chances are these are the most common types of tests that you're going to be writing, is using shallow. So in this case, we're actually just going to start off with this version of the app. So I just started building it. I just have a title and some boxes. And we are going to use shallow. So basically, Enzyme has three ways of rendering React objects. There is shallow, mount, and render. And what shallow does is it renders just the component and not any of its children. So inside of this component you have title, so it wouldn't render any of the things inside title, it would just render this component. Whereas render actually renders this into static HTML, and mount renders this component along with all of its children. So best practice here is always use shallow if you can. This will actually render the component that you're testing, and it ensures that you aren't indirectly testing on the behavior of the child components. So another concept with your tests is that they should just be testing one thing, and they should be isolated, so you know where the problem really is when they're failing. So in this case, in this case, I am not following TDD. Don't tell anyone. But one thing that helps me actually when I write in React is I actually like to write the components first sometimes, and I like to check on what are the highest value things to test in this component. So when you think back to that concept, like anything with logic, in this component, for me, I think the highest value things to test would just be to check that there's actually an array of 25 boxes coming out, and also that here it's a little bit of logic, like I'm actually incrementing the number by 1. So in the index would be 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. I want the number to be 1, 2, 3, 4. And I might also test the title, just because like if the title's not there, then users would be like really confused as to what that weird like meaty thing is. So for me that's important. So those are the three things that I'm going to test in this shallow, in this example. So in this case, so there's an additional gotcha if you're using the latest version of React. So if you're using the latest version of React with Create React App, there's actually some additional config you need to use Enzyme with it. And I think there's a very helpful message when you try to run this anyway without that, so it'll like just directly take you to the link for how to set up Enzyme with React 16. If we break down the things here, there's a before each. This is for any setup that you need to do before each of your tests. And there's also another helper that Jest gives you, which is called before all, which if you have set up that you need to do before all of your tests run, I mean, pretty self-explanatory, but you can use that. And there's also after each and after all. So in this case, I would just find that a title exists, and I would expect that to be true. Next, I'm also testing that it has the correct number of boxes, and that the props is correct. So the gotcha on this page is that you can actually use a contains assertion. I've seen some people do that in using Enzyme. And this isn't actually very flexible to use contains, so the difference between contains and find is contains actually doesn't take a selector, it takes the React element itself. So in order to assert that it has an admin calendar box, you would need to actually print out the admin calendar box, write out the admin calendar box with all of its attributes there. And really, I don't really care about the key, because the key is just like something that React needs. It's not really important to my app. So it's better to explicitly kind of assert on the props that you expect to be there and also the component itself. Cool, so next thing. So I mentioned before that it's really good to use shallow. So one reason that people end up using mount is that I think on projects that I've been on, I think developers have thought that in order to test the lifecycle methods of a component, you need to use mount. It's not so you can't actually interact. For example, if you're trying to test state, it's hard to do that in shallow. That's actually not true. It's super easy to do that with shallow, and I think hopefully this will encourage you, if you're not doing it already, to test all the lifecycle methods in your component as well. So in this case, okay, I think this plays. Does it play? Yeah. Okay, I have this video just to remind you of what we're building here. So in this example, we're actually building a advent calendar box. And the way the advent calendar box works is when you click on the button on the box, it'll open, if it's not already open already. So this is an example of how you would write that. And as I mentioned, we have this on click, which triggers the box click, and it sets the state to open if it's not already open, and if the box is openable. It also does something in the component will mount. So I just added this to show you how to test your lifecycle methods. So just in the component will unmount. So when this component unmounts, it will set the state of the box back to false. So say you, I don't know, leave the page or something, you come back, it'll be closed again. Cool. So this is the test I've written for it. So this is actually just a basic test, similar to the one in the previous one. But in this case, I'm actually checking if the box has an open class. And this is kind of to show you that in this component, even though it's a shallow render, it still sets the state on the box to be open, and then it appends the class. The other handy thing that you can do, I just discovered this recently actually, is that Enzyme provides you with this debug function. So if you're ever confused about like what is actually going on with your component, you can console log wrapper.debug, and it'll actually print out the component for you, so whatever gets rendered. So this is really handy because sometimes like you just need to access the HTML and you don't know what's going on. Yeah. So this first example is actually how you can simulate the click event. So that's one thing you might be confused about, is that you need something to happen on click, right? And how do you test the click event? And the way that you do it is that you actually can, once you grab onto the element, you can simulate click, and the only thing that you have to mock is this click event. So you can actually, because in my code I did event prevent default. If you don't pass in this click event, it'll complain. So yeah, so this is how you would simulate a click, and then you can just check. So I assert beforehand that the box isn't open, and then afterwards I assert that it is open, like it has that open class. And this is the most exciting part of this whole example. It's basically talking about how do you test the lifecycle methods of the component. So React actually gives you, React has a bunch of lifecycle methods, which is the component will unmount, component did mount, all of those things. And the way that you can access it, even though you're using a shallow render, is you can actually access the instance of the wrapper. So accessing the instance of the wrapper will give you access to all of those instance methods that you defined inside of the wrapper. So in this case, here, handle box click is an instance method, component will unmount is an instance method, and once you've defined the instance here, you can actually trigger all of those methods directly. So this is really nice. So like actually, for example, in that onClick, you could do it directly here. You don't actually have to click the element. Like you could just trigger that handle box click directly. You might not want to do this because you might want to also check that like what the user actually does, which is click the box, works. But I mean, if you want to, like this is really simple to do. The other thing is that you can actually trigger that lifecycle method. So you can do instance dot component will unmount, and yeah, and you can just check that that thing works. So that's really nice. So you should never have to use mount except for, and we probably won't get to these examples, but except for probably in cases, for example, when you're using Redux, when you want to actually check that the store things that happen when you trigger the things that require the store or dispatch methods, etc. Those are probably the times when you want to use mount because you can't really do that. You can't pull in all the dependencies of the component using shallow. But if it's contained in your component, you should be able to test it using shallow. Cool, so we got some bonus examples. I'm not exactly sure what time I started. I think it was maybe 8? Yeah? Okay, cool. So I think I have about 10 minutes left maybe. And yeah, so bonus examples because it's Christmas. You're super excited about these. Cool, so I mentioned before snapshot testing. How many of you guys have done snapshot testing? Okay, cool. What kind of things do you use snapshot testing for? I mean, do you cover all of your components? Sorry, I'm totally putting you on the spot here. Yeah.
Yeah, all of the components.
All of your components you write snapshot tests for? Okay, cool. Yeah, so for those of you who have not done snapshot testing before, what is snapshot testing? So I found this GIF that someone created. I didn't create it, sadly, on a blog talking about snapshot testing, and I think this is their way of explaining to you what is snapshot testing. So in this example, I guess that is your component, and this is just taking a snapshot of your component at that moment in time. So for the purposes of our example, our component is this title. So remember in the first example, you saw that title component, so I'm actually going to write the code for this title component. So it's a very meaty Advent Christmas calendar. And I will be testing this component using just. So how do you do that? Okay, so this is the component. And why is snapshot testing so powerful? Okay, maybe I will show you the example and then I'll come back to that. So how do you write your first snapshot test? And what does a snapshot mean? So if this is my component, this is the title component, and this is my snapshot test. And the way that you use this snapshot testing is you actually have to install the separate library. Jest supports it, but it still needs an additional library in order to actually run the snapshot tests. So you just install this library called React Test Renderer. And then all of the snapshot tests essentially look like this. You use the renderer, you put in the component that you're testing, and you output it to JSON, and then you just expect the tree to match the snapshot. So what is a snapshot? So this is a snapshot. So actually what it creates for you is this file that has taken a snapshot of your automagically, it has created a snapshot of your component in the way that it looked at that point in time, right? So if you look at my component here, all of the divs and class names, etc., all of the content is outputted in this snapshot test. And you can actually, in your test code, you can set the component up with various props, right? So say, for example, you wanted to, in the Advent box example, you wanted the box to be open. You could actually set that component up with the correct props beforehand, and it will create a different block of these for each of the tests. And the really, really nice thing about this is, I said you should be testing anything with logic. A lot of times we spend time testing whether or not things exist in our components. I said the title was important, so I want to test it. But these kind of tests are kind of boring to write, and there's not any logic in this component anyway. It's just like a simple display. So snapshot testing is just something you can add to your toolbox to kind of speed up the process of writing these kind of more boring tests. And hopefully it'll get you testing more and testing all of your components like that lady. Yep, so that is snapshot testing. Actually, sorry, wait, I'm not finished with snapshot testing because I'll show you how you actually update the snapshot test, which is probably a little bit more valuable. I got a little ahead of myself there. Yeah, so this is the snapshot that you've created in that point in time. And say, for example, you update it. So actually you want this line to be red. What will happen then is that the test will fail. So it's up to you to actually update the snapshot test after it's been created. So I think the highest value is probably to write the snapshot tests once you have some meat in your components, so you're not having to update them as frequently throughout the whole process. So in this case, it would flag that it's missing the red, and you just have to go in. It creates this file in a snapshot folder in your app, and you just go in and update that. And yeah, so here I'm updating the snapshot that Jess has created, and then that test will pass. So that's how you use snapshot testing. Yep. So I'm actually probably going to skip over this higher order component. The biggest takeaway here for testing higher order components is that you can, if you've used higher order components before, and we had a presentation on that in the last React Girls, what you can do is you can actually just create a mock, wrapped component instead of the actual component that the higher order component is wrapping, and this just simplifies things. Yeah. So you've done some testing, you want to learn more, there's lots that you want to know. All of the things that I talked about here, so Jest, Enzyme, etc. The docs are actually amazing. The React docs, most of you probably already know, are amazing, but They also have a section on testing in particular. So for example, inside Redux, there's a whole page on like how do you write tests for Redux, and it covers like actions, reducers, a connected component, setting up your provider and store. So I didn't really have to go over that because like if you just look at that page, it's enough. The other thing is, this is just like an aside that I wanted to share. So if you are ever doing a lot of API calls, you might want to look into using sagas. So this is something that we used on my last project because it's really hard to test all the side effects from API calls. And sagas, it's another version. So there's Redux Thunk, and then there's also sagas. And one reason that you might want to use sagas is because it is super, super easy for you to test. So say, for example, you have an API call and this, and this happens afterwards, or etc. They just provide you with a really nice way to test those actions, and they're kind of nice to use in general. So that would be my advice for testing sagas. Cool, that's it. Thank you.